Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank you for coming today. My name is Mike Light. I'm the department head for the Social Science Department, and I help prepare and put on this Race and Ethnicity Conference, which we try to do every year. I am not going to take up too much of your time today because the main attraction is Professor Susan Williams, we'll get to in just a few minutes, but I did want to let you know that we have a whole host of events this week. This is the very first presentation in the conference series, but the event will be capped by our keynote speaker on Thursday night, and I wanted to make you aware of this in case you're interested. This year we're really fortunate to have Professor Isabel Wilkerson, who is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and author, coming to Grand Rapids Community College. Her book this year is called The Warmth of Other Suns, and it's about the Great Migration of African Americans around the turn of the century from the Deep South to the industrial Midwest and the West Coast. And she's been on Oprah, so you know she's a big deal, right? Anybody who's been on Oprah is a big deal. But she's a really amazing speaker. I'm hopeful that you all will find some time in your schedule to come out Thursday night. It's at 7:30. And it's in the Spectrum Theater on the other side of campus here at GRCC. We expect a pretty big crowd, so get there early. There might even be some goodies for you afterwards, some food, some free food. So if you're interested in that, I encourage you to come out. Today's speaker, Professor Williams, is an assistant professor of European history here at Grand Rapids Community College. And some of you, I know, have had her for classes on campus, or you're currently taking a class from her, so I don't have to tell you this, but she does some amazing work at these conferences. She's always been a star in these presentations, so I'm excited for what she's going to talk about today. She comes to us from Indiana University, and some of her research interests include European history, the study of identity, history of gender and sexuality, the study of interwar Europe, the history of science, and the study of the modern Roma. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Professor Susan Williams.
I got a hoot. That was pretty cool. Well, thanks for coming today. This is a subject that's near and dear to my heart because I think that studying the Imperial Gaze and what that means, and we'll go into all this terminology and everything else and kind of deconstruct it today. I mean, that really does tell us about our modern ideas about race and where they come from. We're going to bring in gender and sexuality here. And we're going to be focusing on a larger story about hegemony and about the construction of identities. And then we're going to break it down, narrow it down a little bit, and talk about individuals. Sarki Bartman over there on the left, who is also known derisively as the Hottentot Venus. Here's Ada Benga. He was an African brought in as an exhibit in part to the St. Louis World's Fair and also to the Bronx Zoo. We're going to talk about his personal story as well to kind of raise empathy and awareness about what it is when we talk about the local level and the real experience of people under imperialism, what that meant. And it's a pretty horrible story, and I'm sorry in advance for depressing all of you. So I'm going to kick this off. I mean, what we're going to do today is have a conversation about power and control. So what we're really looking at is how race is constructed. We're going to talk about how these constructions of race were discussed during the 19th century into the 20th century. We're going to talk about how they were employed through ideas that they fit into an ideology that roughly that historians call the new imperialism. So this is an insidious process, and that's the only way to describe it. And this also has very deep meanings and power within our society today. So we're going to explore where these ideas about race came from. We're going to think about how people were taught about racial difference. We're going to think about why people bought these ideas, because we can't talk about hegemony and power structures as something that was forced onto people or that somehow people were brainwashed into believing it. They get dividends out of hegemonic systems. So we've got to construct this, think about how this all works. And we want to also think about how these ideas impacted individual lives. We're going to do this with typical conference format, so if you could just save your questions for the end, because if you don't, I'll totally get off topic and just sit around and BS with you for like an hour and never actually get to the points that we wanted to cover today. So let's take a look at this. So if we're looking at one thing that we're going to have to accept here is that identity is socially constructed. And what we mean when we talk about things being historically constructed, we're talking about concepts or practices and how those concepts and practices are constructed through social ideas. So what we have to accept here is that race, that gender, that sexuality, it's not inherent, it's not biological, but rather it's how we envision race. It's how we envision gender and sexuality. And the best way to remember this is the idea that if you look at this from a scientific viewpoint, there is actually more genetic variance within groups than there is between groups. So therefore, if you look at race and you say it doesn't exist, what we're saying there is there's actually no scientific proof that race exists. That race in and of itself, how we talk about race, how we imagine it, what we desire to get with these conversations about race, those are all things that are constructed by societies. They differ over place and space and time. They differ by what, these concepts differ by what community that you're talking about, what society you're talking about. So we are specifically going to focus on the 19th century into the 20th century in the European and American imagination here. So one of the things we have to think about when you create an identity, when you construct an identity, you're not really creating your identity in a vacuum. What historians and sociologists will tell you is you actually create an identity by looking at an other, somebody that you've identified as an other. So by constructing them, by talking about them, who they are, how they behave, and we'll see even within this construct whether they're human or not human, right? As all part of the human family. That's you constructing an other, and therefore you're constructing your own identity. I am not this. So you're talking about binaries, right? That person is this, so I am this. You're gonna see this. I'm just kind of entering this up into our conversation here. That's really what we're going to be talking about today, is how is it that we construct these identities. So to give you, this is my race in a nutshell talk, so we'll see if I can do this in like 10 minutes. If you want to think about where some of these ideas come from, we actually have to look back into antiquity. So during the late antique period, so we're talking about Greeks and Romans there. You have a variety of people that are constructing what the idea of Greek means. This is Plato and Aristotle, right? What Greek means versus who everybody else is. So what you do is you talk quite a bit about the barbarians. The barbarians, that's a Greek term that my class knows full well. We've talked about it before. The word comes from barbar, and what the Greeks say is, oh, all those people who don't speak Greek, they all speak this language that always sounds like bar, 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 bar when they talk. And so therefore, everybody who doesn't speak Greek and who doesn't look Greek and doesn't act Greek is a barbarian. So that's where some of those first ideas come from about these kinds of constructions. Now, if you feed this in and think about what this means for Europeans and European history, we can actually look at the Pythagorean table of opposites. So this was your general idea about how the world worked coming out of the Greeks. This is right around the 5th century BCE. Pythagoras, you all have been tortured with him in any geometry class that you've taken, right? He sets up this list, and he says, okay, so if you look, finite, infinite, odd, even, one, many, right, left, rest, motion, straight, crooked, light, darkness, good, evil, square, oblong, male, female. And the idea that starts to come out of the Greek period is that all of this stuff on the left of the list is good, and it's normative. And everything that's on the right of the list is not normal. So when you think about Western civilization, what we mean when we talk about that and we label classes that way, whether rightly or wrongly, is the idea. Western civilization comes out of a mixture of a bunch of really interesting ideologies. So you have a Greco-Roman tradition that comes together with a Judeo-Christian tradition. So therefore, the Greco-Roman tradition is going to edify, right? And it's going to support and legitimize that Judeo-Christian tradition, which means things that you might not have seen before actually is a way that helps you to understand your world, right? These black and white binaries. Now, if you bring this into the Middle Ages, because then you've got to think, okay, well, where did some of these ideas come from? You also got to think about who people in the Middle Ages were. People in the Middle Ages tend to be, we would consider them, in Oprah speak, kind of negative, right? These are people who really do believe that the material world is evil, that it's tainted, that it's full of sin. And so they juxtapose in their binary, in their whole view of the cosmos, their worldview. They say, you have the earth, and the earth is tainted. That's where human beings live. We fell there. And that's where we have to kind of deal with a sucky life until we get into what's good. That's the spiritual, right? You die and you go to heaven if you do what you're supposed to do on earth. And one of the ways that they understand this is they say that every human being is born with original sin. So when you're born, you're already tainted. You're tainted because you're part of this material world, and you're tainted by decisions that Adam and Eve made in the garden. which means one of the stories coming out of the medieval world is the idea that you got to think about control, that in their worldview, human beings are closer to animals than they are closer to God. And you can see this even with how they kind of see their cosmos here. Here you have animals. They want to make it a good animal so they don't make themselves seem too sucky, right? So it's a lion next to the human being, but way up here is God. Right? And these are all the things of the spiritual. And you're separated by that. And so therefore, on Earth, one of the things that people talk about is how do you control animalistic natures? How do you make sure human beings don't take that next step and become animals, right? And enact animalistic behaviors, which means social control is going to be very, very important in the medieval world. The other thing, so here you have an image. This comes from the French Revolution, but you see these images all over the place during the late Middle Ages. So you have a pope, you have a justice, you have a bureaucrat, and they're all riding on the backs of the peasantry. So the idea is all of these groups are supposed to work together. Anybody who's not a member of those who work in society, which by the way is about 85% of the population. Anybody who does everything from begging all the way up to people who are very famous merchants who make a lot of money. That's a third estate. And those are people that you have to control, because if you don't control them, they'll pick fights with each other, they'll go back to that animalistic nature, they'll start wars, they'll start all kinds of general social problems. You have chaos, Armageddon happens, and then nothing good's going to come of it. So therefore, one of the stories for the medieval world is trying to figure out ways to control people. Now, if you bring in this Pythagorean table of opposites into it, you start to see more and more, coming into early Christianity, the definition that everything that's white and pure is a symbol of the spiritual realm. And that everything that's dark and black, that's something, because it's binaries, right? White is good, black is bad. Already, so the way that they define themselves, they define the devil as black. They define, when they say that they have bad thoughts, they don't call them bad thoughts, they call them dark thoughts. Right? We still use this kind of terminology today. We invest in it. So that tells you about the power of some of these ideas and how they continue in society over time. So you bring in a couple of things together here, but now we've actually got to bring in some new issues that are going to inform our story coming into the 19th century. So, during the 19th century, states are very, very interested in making very good babies who will raise to be good workers and good citizens who will go off to fight for those states. They want to have a lot of them, and they want to make sure that they're going to be malleable and that they're going to be informed about what their responsibilities to the state are. And so one of the things that you start to see by the time you get into the 1860s and 1870s is people having a conversation about how is it that we can, whether we breed people together or whether we try to make sure that some people don't have sex and other people do, how is it that we can try to make the best babies we can? So that's, so what you're talking about here is an issue of competition within society and between societies, right? How is it that England can make the best English babies so that we can always beat the French? And vice versa, right? So this is starting to inform the story here a little bit. Now, 1870s and 1880s, we've got to get into a couple of new ideologies. One of them is social Darwinism. What social Darwinists do, and this is a bit of a difficult, it's a sticky wicket here. Social Darwinists are not Darwinists. Darwin would be ashamed of the social Darwinists. But what they do is they take one line in Darwin, one idea, called survival of the fittest, and they say, well, what happens if we actually applied this to society in general? And I threw a couple of things up here for you to look at. In Darwin, in his Origin of Species, he says competition between individual organisms of a singular species drives biological evolutionary change. This is what's called speciation. Now, what people who are really interested in these pro-natalist policies and making a good state and competition between states, how to make England the best state possible, how to make the United States the best state possible, they grab onto this. They like this idea. But Herbert Spencer, who's one of the people who writes extensively about this idea of social Darwinism, he changes Darwin, which is why Darwin wouldn't like him very much. He says competition between all individuals, groups, and nations drives the evolution of society. So what he's looking at here is societal progress and that issue. So he fully believes that competition is natural, that you should encourage competition, that competition in and of itself between people, between groups, between what's going to end up being termed races, that's actually what drives the progress of society forward. So that's one of the things that we're going to be breaking down. Because what you're going to see is during this new imperialist period, people are going to latch on to this concept of social Darwinism as a justification for taking over new lands, for competing with other groups, and for not just taking over other lands, but the idea with imperialism is that you have complete control not just of territory and economics, but you have control of that society and culture in general. So we've got to bring that into our story as we move along today. The other thing that you see coming out of this era is the idea of what we call the white man's burden. This is a very famous poem by Rudyard Kipling. He's the one who kind of just puts it all out there. But people were talking about it from about the 1700s on. And the idea of the white man's burden was that it's the duty of white Europeans as the people who are winning, right, this whole conflict. It's their job to go forward into other societies and other cultures, and they're supposed to civilize other peoples. So what that means is to bring what is European to those people. Now you got to think about something else here within competition. Herbert Spencer and a variety of others are talking about these ideas, but with the acknowledgement that they're already on top. And there's a built-in issue with social Darwinism that all the people who aren't on top when you start talking about social Darwinism will never be on top. They'll always lag behind. They're never going to be modern. They're never going to be civilized. So if you bring that idea into the white man's burden, the idea here is you get those people as civilized, as less animalistic as possible in the European mind. You bring them civility, you bring them religion, you bring them the English language or the French language or the German language as a way to be able to better control those people, with the general idea being that they're never actually going to become fully human. So we've got to think about how it is that they're setting up these languages. That's what we'll be looking at for the rest of the time. So when we talk about the Imperial Gaze, what you're looking at there is that concept of the other. So you have imperialists. People who are working with those ideas of social Darwinism and the white man's burden, and they're looking at other cultures. And they're always going to understand that culture through their own experience. So they're not, they say that they're going to learn about these cultures, that they want to know more about their history, and they want to know more about their civilizations and their languages and their traditions. But what they do is write books that always judges them within this idea of of social Darwinism itself. That actually all of their traditions, their languages, their religions, their culture in general, their politics, that's a symbol to Europeans as they set up these binaries of uncivilized behavior. So everything that's not European, right, is uncivilized. It's not normal. So therefore, what's the opposite of normal? Huh? Abnormal, right? So when people talk about something being abnormal, what kind of language do they use? Very different, with that little look on their face when they say it. Primitive. Anything else? Deviant. Anything else? I'm just asking. You're like a thesaurus for me today. So, when we think about the Imperial Gaze, so think about it like a movie camera. So the Europeans will be the movie camera, and they're filming an object. They're not trying to understand that object. They're filming it, and then they're going to come back home, and they're going to write about that object. And they're always going to use their ideas, right, of social Darwinism and of that white man's burden to legitimize why it is that they should be in control of those people. So that's a very important thing to understand here. So what they're doing is, in fact, legitimizing imperialism itself. And they're going to construct identity. So their interpretations about traditions and religions and languages and politics, they're all going to come with this idea built in that their interpretations are always going to suit this argument about imperialism in general. Right? It's going to legitimize why it is that Europeans should be there. Now, another thing to think about, we talked about power and control. We got to think about hegemony. Hegemony is one of those words. You see it occasionally, but you never quite understand it. So I'll try to explain it as clearly as I possibly can. Hegemony basically, the best way to understand it is that what you're doing, hegemony is all about power. And it's very, very deep power. And so if you talk about a hegemonic system, that's a system where you have a dominant group who creates social constructions to inform other people within that group who might not be dominant, whether socially or for whatever reason, gender-wise, why it is that they are right, why it is that their ideas are normative and ideas that go against it are not normal, right, are deviant to that. Now, hegemony, it's really easy to fall into this idea that when you talk about hegemonic systems, that that's about brainwashing, right? That it's a dominant group forcing other people to believe it. But the way that you have to think, and a variety of scholars, particularly people who work on imperialism, have really pulled this idea of hegemony apart. And they say, well, actually, you got to think about dividends. So think about England, for example. In the 19th century, who would you say is in charge in England in the 19th century, if you had to just kind of label them as a group? Aristocrats. Anybody else?
Queen.
Kings and queens are going to have something to say here.
Parliament.
Parliament. Who's more and more able to participate in Parliament? During the 19th century, what social class? The middle class, right? So they're going to be, they're going to have pretty decent dividends from this power. Who's not going to have a lot of good dividends from arguments about power in a hegemonic system in the 19th century? What social group in England? People who work, free farm holders in the countryside. Who else? There's a big group.
Women.
Women. Who else?
Servants.
The servant class, people who are on that lower end of, what do we call that class?
Proletariat.
Huh?
Proletariat.
The proletariat, the industrial working class. So the working classes in general aren't really going to, we would look at them normally in a normal story about England and we would say, wow, those are the people who don't have power in that hegemonic system. And the middle class and the aristocrats, they have a lot of power. The men in those groups have a lot of power. But then you bring it into imperialism. And that's where we get into really interesting issues about hegemony in this concept. Because hegemony only works because you agree to allow it to work. So therefore, you're getting something back from these ideas about what normative behavior is. So whereas in England, the working class men might not have any power, you're going to feel damn good when people start talking about black people in Africa, because that's a group that doesn't exist largely during the 19th century in England. But you can look at those people and you can go visit those people and see them in person, and that's a moment where you have power, where you understand in a hierarchy, a social hierarchy, there are people under you. Right? So we've got to think about why, that's what we call buying into hegemony. Right? Hegemony wouldn't work. The whole idea of hegemony wouldn't work if people stopped playing the game. If people reject the concept of normative and they reject binaries. If they stop playing. But hegemonies always work because you give people dividends and they buy into it, right? So one of the things that we're going to see quite a bit of, we've already introduced that talking about the Middle Ages, dehumanization. They're really going to focus on animalistic natures. They're going to focus, Rudyard Kipling very, very famously calls people from other cultures who are not European half human and half child. So the idea, or sorry, half devil and half child. And so the idea there is, they're partly satanic, right? So you got a problem right there on your hands, and half child, which means that they're never going to become adults, which means you need a father. You need somebody to walk in, make them toe the line, give them the rules, set up how they're supposed to behave, right? So dehumanization in and of itself is going to be a very important factor when we talk about that imperial gaze. So they're going to be talking about people as primitive. So either they're less human, they're more animalistic, right? That's the dehumanization. And then when you talk about people being primitive, the ideal there is, well, we can try to bring them up to a certain level, but we're always going to be more modern. So they're always going to be more primitive within that schema of modernization and ideas about modernity. So the other thing that you're going to see quite a bit of, that's where we bring gender and sexuality into it. They're going to sexualize the other. They want to talk about African men, for example, and Asian men being less masculine. Or alternately, what they'll talk about is they can't control their animalistic instinct. They're less human. So therefore, they need someone to come in because they're a threat to white women. They talk about this extensively, this idea that anybody who's not European or not American during this period of time is a sexual danger to American and European women. They'll talk about women from other regions. They'll talk about them being overly sexualized. They become so sexualized, they're uninhibited, that they're actually a danger to society as well, and thus they need to be controlled. They're really going to play up, and we'll see some images a little bit later, but they're really playing up this sexualization. And so thus, if you take the case, we're going to focus in particular on Africa today. If you take the case of African women, the way that they write about them is absolutely horrific. I mean, they talk, extensively about how they're open sexually, how a good imperialist understands that if he goes to Africa, the African women will welcome him and have sex with him, that they're not as inhibited as those uptight middle-class women in Europe and in America, but at the same time, they're a danger, right? If you get too engrossed in becoming native is what they call it. If you become too sympathetic to these people, then they've lured you in. That's how they do it, through their sexuality, right? So we'll examine some of this as well. So what we're getting at here is exploitation, and that's what they're going to do. They're going to exploit populations in all of these different regions, whether it's the Philippines, whether it's Samoa, whether it's Africa, whether it's Asia. And by exploitation, we're really going to see egregious exploitation. They're going to kidnap people and put them in human zoos to show people in Western Europe and the United States what these other peoples look like, what primitiveness looks like, what animalistic behavior looks like. Now, when we also think about exploitation, we've got to think about why they're doing it in the first place. One of the things that they'll tell the people who are parts of these human zoos is they're not allowed to dress in European clothing, that they need to play drum music, that they need to sell beads, that they need to put on shows for the people, because they don't ever want you to be sympathetic to these people. They don't want you to build up any kind of empathy for them. This is supposed to be an education for the people coming to these human zoos and coming to these exhibitions to again, underline that hegemonic idea, underline these constructions of what the other is, because you're supporting imperialism by doing that. So, if you want to think about social Darwinism, this is how people look at other cultures. This is from a science textbook in 1857, a book called The Indigenous Races of the Earth. It's a very famous image, and one of the most popular ones to use in history courses about these kinds of issues, but there are tons of these types of issues. So what's the story in this image? What do they want you to know in a science class in 1857? The white person's on top. This is the Apollo Belvedere. This is a statue that's supposed to show you perfection of the European species. What's the other part of this story?
That they're only one step up from monkeys, whereas the white man is 2 steps.
Yeah. So the idea here, you see the whole schema, the hierarchy here. The Apollo Belvedere, that perfect example of ancient culture and sculpture, that's at the top. And then sitting in between them and a chimpanzee, not just Negroes, as they term it on this image, but it's going to be any native peoples from anywhere, right, that fits into your imperial story. So you'll see all kinds of images depending on, for Americans in 1898, it'll be a picture of a Filipino, right? For English Protestants, looking at the Irish in the same period of time, here you have an English Protestant man. Over there on the right, you have the Negro, and in between the two, you have an Irish Iberian. What does Iberian mean? Who is this person? What religion? Catholic. So, an Irish Catholic on this big hierarchy sits in between the perfect English Protestant and an African. Right? So they're even doing this within their own states. We've got to think about this, as well, how this works within Europe. Florence Nightingale, perfect middle-class woman. What did she do? What's she so famous? Nursing, right? She's the one who actually makes field hospitals rational. So there's the perfect middle-class English Protestant woman. Who's on the right?
Irish.
Yeah, it's her name on this is Bridget McBruiser. And Mick tells you what religion is she?
Irish.
She's Irish Catholic, right? So again, they're making this story about the Irish being less evolved than the English. All right. So then you got to figure out, okay, well, that's all well and good. I mean, there's a hegemonic issue where they start to construct issues of race. They socially construct it to be able to legitimize imperialism. Then we got to figure out how they do this, because that's a really difficult task. That's where we get into things like the eugenics movement. Now, this is really going to take off 1920s, 1930s, but eugenics as a science is already starting up by the time that you get into the 1870s, and it goes hand in hand with the concept of social Darwinism. So eugenics, this is a front piece for the eugenics movement. Eugenics is the self-direction of human evolution. So people, they're very self-confident, very optimistic about themselves coming out of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. So they're saying that states are going to start fiddling around to make sure that a society evolves perfectly. And you can see the insidious nature of this idea. Because as you see, all of these little tree branches of eugenics themselves, it completely depends on every social science, every hard science playing along. You'll see people who create culture, people like Rudyard Kipling who writes children's books. What's Rudyard Kipling's children's books? The Jungle Book, Kim, Rikki Tikki Tavi, that kids are reading constantly. These ideas are going to be built in. The white man's burden is going to be built into all those children's books. Take that, right? Cartoons from the 1920s. That's going to be built in here. But then look, anatomy, biology, physiology, psychology, genetics, mental testing, anthropometry, history, geology, anthropology, archaeology, ethnology, geography, statistics, genealogy, biography, economics, politics, sociology, religion, education, surgery, psychiatry, and medicine. So the whole idea about the eugenics process is to completely construct this narrative within your entire college experience, within your entire educational experience. That is the story. And you're going to see people, as we go forward, I got a good quote for you where you're really going to be able to see this. Some states say this is a good thing. This is a picture of Romanian peasants, and this is part of the eugenics process in the 1920s. So here you have all the different, you have the profile and different images of heads being taken. And what they're trying to do there is to identify, if you go out into the countryside and you grab a bunch of peasants and you take their photos in this way, scientifically, they would say, then you would be able to identify, once you combine all of these images, what a real Romanian looks like, right? And then your whole goal is to use the whole eugenics movement to construct a new generation of the perfect Romanian. So they go into the country, they do this, and then we can get into zoos there within states. This is the Museu Sadawi in Bucharest. You can still go there whenever you go to Bucharest. It's the peasant museum. And the whole idea is a village museum, Sadawi's village. So you have, what they did is they went into the countryside, they knocked down people's doors, they informed people that they were taking their houses as perfect examples of culture, Romanian culture, and architecture. And if they wanted to, they could come along for the ride. And they take all of these buildings, the perfect examples of Romanian peasant architecture from all over the country. They bring them all to Bucharest, they plop them down by a river, they let the people keep living in them, and then you, as a Romanian living in Bucharest, who's long gone from the countryside, or at least that's what the state's hoping, you can go and be re-edified about the soul of the nation by seeing these people, by listening to them play music, by experiencing them, by seeing Romanian architecture. Now, anybody who takes my Russian East Europe class knows that Romania is a very ethnically and religiously diverse area in the Balkans. What they didn't bring along is Hungarian architecture and German architecture and a variety of other different types of architecture. Because what they want to do is create a story of greater Romania and what that should mean to people. It did I got to throw out the story, it did backfire on them. What they thought was people would go during opening hours, they would say, yes, look at those peasants, they're in such horrible conditions, but at the same time, I see myself in them, I see the soul of the nation. My grandma used to sing that song to me. I used to eat that sarmale, the stuffed cabbage leaves, when she would make them for me. I feel more Romanian. What ended up happening was most of the people living in Bucharest at the time were only about half a generation to one generation removed from the countryside. So they all started going in the off time and hanging out with all the peasants who they happen to be related to a lot of the time from these villages, hanging out, drinking soika, which is plum brandy, with them, and playing music. And then the government actually had to shut it down. They evicted all the peasants from it, kept their houses, and then therefore you go to a ghost town now to learn more about your Romanian soul. Right? So sometimes these kinds of ideas can backfire. So then let's turn our gaze to where the heck did people get this idea that you should put people in zoos? So during the medieval period, this really takes off during 1500s and 1600s in the early modern period, and as part of the scientific revolution. You have cabinets of curiosities. That's a precursor to a museum. Cabinets of curiosities, really rich men would collect crap. And you could come over to their house and you could have a little bit of wine, and you could look at the crap they collected. For the Dutch, this was all about butterflies, for example, right? They liked their butterflies. They had huge cases full of them, and you could go and you could compare butterflies and talk about, when you bring Darwin into it, where do we see the evolution of butterflies? Where did they come from? Ponder these things while getting drunk on good brandy. Now, for other people, they collected other things. Some people liked birds, stuffed birds. They liked feathers, whatever you were interested in. But the other thing that we see coming out of the late Middle Ages into the early modern period is some people say, well, I have a lot of power and I want to show people that I have power. So I have animals, and that's one way that you could make yourself look really powerful. Lots of animals from areas that nobody had been to before, and animals that nobody had seen before. Most famously, elephants in collections. That was a big thing. The Vatican had an elephant. The Tower of London's menagerie had an elephant. They all died horrific deaths because everybody couldn't figure out what the heck to feed these things. So I believe that in the Tower of London, they fed it bread and wine. So you got a couple of years at most there, right? But if you bring people by and you show them the extent of your power, you show them that people give you these as gifts, that says something about your power as well. But during the Renaissance, there were some very, very wealthy people. The Medicis in Italy are a great example of this, who start to collect human beings. With the ideal being that if you want to show your power, you want to show all of your business contacts, all of the areas that through being a merchant you've come into contact with, you just settle some people in your menagerie. Then you invite your friends over, you have that good brandy, and you talk about how those people are weird and you're not. Which is basically every conversation that they have about it. Let's identify why they're weird, and what does that say about us? Now, sometimes if they want to be really, really liberal, what they'll say is, look at these people. They're all native. They're all so genteel. They run in the wind with the wind flicking back their hair probably, and we've destroyed their culture. We should feel very, very bad about that. And the next time that I open up my plantation and I start yelling at my slaves about the kind of tobacco that they're raising, I'll really think about Native Americans, right? And think about what we've done. And then I'll enjoy and reap the benefits from my plantation. But the idea about the noble savage as well. The noble savage was never meant to be Europeans talking about another culture. Right? The specificities of that other culture, what made that other culture great. The whole concept of the noble savage is how to critique Europeans by looking at another culture. Look at Native Americans. And this is one thing that runs through. If you look at conversations about Roma, conversations about Native Americans, they're like, those nomadic peoples, they don't own property. We own too much property. Those people, I heard that they don't even have a word for war. Right? Come on. But we have a word for war. I heard that they don't even have a word for money. We have words for money. What does this say about us as a society and how consumerist we are, how competitive we are, right? That's about as good as it gets. It's about the most that you can expect. If you're looking at positive responses about other cultures during this period of time. So you have those cabinets of curiosities, you have menageries, with the whole idea being that if you own knowledge, and that's one thing that they're celebrating, during the early modern period, during the scientific revolution, the more knowledge that you own, the more control you have, the more power you have. States are really happy talking about this. Let's get as much knowledge. Let's start a royal observatory. Let's have a royal menagerie. Because the more knowledge, the more things that we understand, the more knowledge that we acquire and that we show to people means we are powerful, right? So that's kind of in the background here as well. Expositions start up. You start to see them really taking off. So in other words, it's not just about me and my friends drinking brandy, looking at my cabinet of curiosity, but I need to edify and educate all of those poor schlumps of the working class and that third estate who we all have to control. We need to educate them more about why it's important to think about other cultures and control those other cultures. That's where you get expositions from. So the idea there being, you bring these peoples to educate and to edify your own hegemonic system, right? And I should say this is an interpretation. They actually talk about it in this way. They say that it's important to sell people this story of imperialism, to educate people about imperialism itself and what's the difference between white people and dark peoples, as they call them during this period of time. This is a French post. You can buy postcards at any of these expositions. This is one that's in Lair. During this is right around the 1880s, 1890s. These really take off. You can have, so it's not just big cities and it's not just world fairs that have these expositions of people. It's little towns, and they'll actually travel on a circuit so that you can come and see these people. So they're showing you there the village, right? And it's going to be a Senegalese village in this case. And we're going to look at more images as we move forward. So let's talk about an individual who's affected by this system. And we can look at Sarki Bartman. Sarki Bartman was Kakoi, which is a tribe in southern Africa. They're also, during the period of new imperialism, well into the 1950s, 1960s, they were called Hottentots, which is actually a derisive term. And it was basically Europeans making fun of how their language sounded. So again, we go back to the Greeks and the barbarians, right? They said, oh, their language, it sounds like Hottentot, Hottentot, Hottentot when they talk. So that's what they start to call them, right? So we see those legacies right there. Sarki Bartman, she grew up, the Kakoi were basically, we could look at them as a hunter-gatherer society in what's now South Africa. Her whole village was wiped out. There's a series in the late 1700s and then again in the early 1900s. There are huge pogroms against native populations in South Africa because occasionally you'll have moments of rebellion, and they decided to eradicate the possibility of rebellion. Her husband, her children were killed during the raid, and she went to seek work in a larger town in the region. When she was there, the brother-in-law of her employer, some say her owner, we're not quite sure whether she was actually considered a slave when she was in this when she was in this household, but the brother-in-law said she looks really funny, and we'll talk about that when we look at some images of her. But she looks really funny. And so what he did is he talked to her employer and proposed a deal. What he wanted to do was put her up on exhibition in England. He wanted to travel with her to educate people about what Africans look like and what they act like. And so what he's going to do, he forces her to travel to England, and he puts her up on exhibition as the Hottentot Venus. And then we'll talk about her death in a few. So this is Sarki Bartman. So at the bottom here, this is actually an ad for this exhibition. Love and Beauty, Sarki the Hottentot Venus. Venus, goddess of love, goddess of what else? Fertility, what else?
Beauty.
Sex, beauty, anything good, right? So they're playing up on this whole idea. Venus is somebody, right? What they'll say, as you see Cupid sitting on her large butt, right, in this image, and that's one thing, they're always going to overplay anything that's vaguely sexual about her. So her breasts and her butt. So take care of your heart. So if you look at her, that's that sexualization. European men are going to come in, they're going to come into contact with her, and they're going to fall in love with her. Because that's what African women are. They're Venuses. They'll welcome you with open arms, you can touch them, and this is the deal with this exhibition. This is kind of a mock-up of what happened during the exhibition. What they would do is put her on a box, and you would pay a little bit of money, and you could come in, and for an extra sum, you could touch her. And so people would come, and they would poke at her, they'd make fun of her, they would try to ask her questions, and then they would examine themselves by examining her. What do you think that woman's doing in this image? What does she look like she's doing? You're all like, I don't want to say it.
Looks like she's checking her out.
Checking what out?
Her private area?
Yeah, she's checking her genitals out. Because the deal with Kakoi women, there was a story going around about them that they had extended labial folds. So therefore, they looked different down there than European women did. So a lot of the women, what they would do is they would go in and they would lift up her skirt to compare themselves to her. So that's where we think about hegemony, you would think, right? At least women might think, God, this is a horrible situation. I mean, I wouldn't want to be in this situation. I wouldn't want any woman to be in this situation. But you see, right, they're getting dividends. They feel really good. Looking at her, seeing her difference, and to them, they talk about these extended labial folds as evidence that she's not fully human, that she's not fully evolved like European women. Right? They write about this extensively. So it's going to support that whole idea about social Darwinism. And then there are other men over here. One of them says, "Oh, what a piece of roast beef! What a piece of meat!" Right? When he looks at her butt. Then you have other ones who say, "Oh, the ridiculousness of nature." Right? Look at this funny woman who's supposed to be human but not. And you see these regularly, repeated regularly. What's the cautionary statement in this image about her?
She'll go after anyone who comes close to her.
Particularly who? The men, right? So the woman's kind of standing in between her and the man. But the idea is she's overly sexualized, she stimulates these men, she's half closed, right? She's primitive. And so therefore she speaks to the more primitive animalistic nature that real human beings, right, is the story here, have to tamp down. Now, the other interesting thing about Saartjie Baartman, what ends up happening, they actually do, there are some people who try to get involved in this issue. They went to one of these things, and they didn't like the fact that she's not given clothes. They only give her this little skirt. So she's not given clothes. It's pretty obvious the person who's setting up all these exhibitions is threatening her as she's standing there if she doesn't turn like people tell her to do, if she won't let people touch her, the people who paid extra money. So he gets a little bit in trouble with the law. They bring her into court. Now think about just basic abusive relationships and basic power issues in these types of issues. She tells the court that she actually hadn't been, that she wasn't being harassed. That she was there of her own free will, and that she was supposed to be getting half of the proceeds from all of this exhibition in particular. Now, all of the people who were providing evidence against the person who was exhibiting her said she wasn't getting any money, that he was torturing her, that he was abusive to her and hitting her, that he had pulled her from her home up into England. But you got to think about the nature of abusive relationships at that point. What does she have to go back to, for one thing? Her family's gone. Her employers are related to the guy who's exhibiting her. She's got nothing. And what ends up happening, people in London stopped kind of coming to the show. A lot of people had seen it at that point. He sells her to another exhibitor in France. In all likelihood, what was going on in France was she was put up for live sex shows at that point. She ends up dying either of tuberculosis or syphilis. We're not quite sure what. A few years later, she died an alcoholic. Years later. What people would do, scientists would come to do sketches of her because they wanted to show the primitiveness of her, these over-exaggerated sexual parts and everything else. So what they would do is talk her into taking off her clothes by giving her candy and giving her liquor, because at that point she was a diehard alcoholic, so her exhibitor would withhold the liquor from her. And then they would come in and get her to take off her clothes so they could do what was called scientific studies of her body. When she died, immediately she was turned into, to the government, the body itself. She was turned to scientists. They cut off her genitals. They cut off her breasts. They took out her brain. They made a plaster mold of her body, which was exhibited into the 1970s at the Evolution Museum, or it was really an Imperial Social Darwinist museum in Paris. So the whole museum itself the function was to support imperialism. But she was exhibited there, and then scientists could do studies of her genitalia. Right? In the 1990s, Nelson Mandela requested France to send her body back, and they finally decided to do so. So they actually took the plaster molds, they took all of the biological ephemera from the body, and they sent it back, and she was reburied there. But that actually took about 20 years of wrangling for them to get the body sent back. So that's the idea, right? You're not human to the people who are exhibiting you, and you're not human to even the scientists, right? They cut up your body afterwards, and you're still an exhibit even after death. Then we can think about these expositions. The expositions during this period of time, I mean, these things are, like I said, some of them are small scale, and some of them are huge. You have these going on. I mean, the big ones happen all the way from the 1890s into the 1930s. We'll talk about a couple in specific as we move forward. But you get a general sense of the story that they're selling to you. Come and see all of these different cultures. This was just a colonial exposition. That was the whole focus of it. But most of these World's Fairs, that was the point. You want to show the greatness of your nation to all of the millions of people. And you're getting huge volumes of people coming to see these. 14 million at one, 28 million at another, who are coming in. You can pay a little bit extra. One of the facets of all of these big World's Fairs and these imperial expositions during the late 1800s and early 1900s was to have a village within that. Now, some of them, they go anywhere from about 50 to 400 people, and you pay a little bit extra to go and encounter the natives at that village. And we'll talk about how those are broken up as we look at some pictures. The last one's in 1958, so it's relatively recent that you see these things petering off. Now, what they would typically do to set these exhibits up. The architecture, what they would do is sell you it that it's a Samoan village or a Filipino village or an African village. What it really was a village as imagined by Europeans. They would construct it well before any of the peoples were brought in to staff that village. Typically, they were just 2x4s with a little bit of plaster over them, which is one of the reasons why some of the Africans who were brought up actually died of exposure during the winters over at these exhibitions. They don't care about the people that were there, and a lot of the people that were there were actually kidnapped and brought up. So either you have a situation where they, we'll talk about Ota Benga in just a minute, but he in particular, his whole family, just like Sarki Bartman, he was informed that. His whole village, he had 2 children who died, he had a wife who died, his entire extended family was obliterated during a pogrom against his village. And then he had a guy who came in who offered him a position at the St. Louis World's Fair, but the way that he sold this to Ota Benga was that he owed him, right? That he had made deals with people who were in control of that general region. He had paid him a bolt of cloth and a pound of sugar. So that Ota Benga was allowed to travel with him. And so therefore, he purchased Ota Benga. And so he plays on this with Benga to a point that he actually is using Ota Benga to coerce other people into coming from other villages along with them to this St. Louis exposition. So they're using people. And they're kind of manipulating people in order to get these villages staffed. So as I said, most of them, and the others are just frankly kidnapped. This is a family. This is a Nook family. This was for the Hamburg Zoo, and that was another thing. These aren't just traveling exhibitions. Most zoos would have them as well during this period of time. So you go to see the animals, and then right alongside the animals, you go to see the people that are what they call the missing link between those animals and you as a European, or you as an American. And that's actually what they say. There's huge exhibits where they have big signs up that says, "See the missing link." But their family was kidnapped into the Hamburg Zoo. A variety of others. These are Casquar Indians from Chile. They were kidnapped as well for just a general European exposition tour during the 1880s. Most of these people didn't make it back alive. Some of them died of diseases, some of them died of exposure. Very few of them are actually going to make it back to their countries. Usually what happens is they're abandoned. Once they get to Europe or the United States, they're told that the fare back to Africa or back to South America is too expensive and that they should just get a job in their new homeland. I think 4 of these people made it back alive to Chile. And recently they've actually brought the bodies back because, again, anytime that they die, scientists are going to come in and they're going to cut the bodies up for study of social Darwinism, right, and evolution in general. So this is one. Hog Beck was a very famous. He's kind of like Barnum, right, for the Barnum Brothers circuses and the freak shows that are going on during the United States in this same period of time, where you can exhibit difference in a different way, right? But he actually has a number of expositions that he's particularly around Germany during this period. And like I said before, they're going to bring in animals and they're going to bring in Africans in particular. But the Africans are going to be told that they're not allowed to speak English, that they're not allowed to wear any kind of European-esque clothing. They're actually issued clothing, so they give them an animal hide to tie around themselves. They tell them that they have to put on shows for the Europeans. And they're, of course, they're shows that are constructed by Europeans to highlight the primitiveness of of that society in general. Again, here's another one of Hog Beck's. And these are all, like I said, these are all postcards. You'd purchase them there and then you'd send them back to show people, like you'd send postcards now. This is a human zoo in Orlan. And what they'd call these are ethnographical exhibitions. There's a new interest. And you can't go into an anthropology class now and think that your anthropology professor thinks this way. It's a professionalized science now. But the first people who are talking about differences between races and different cultures, many of them are social Darwinists in the 1880s and 1870s. And so what they call these are they see this as anthropology exhibits, where you can come into contact not just with animals, but with other cultures. Now, as you see here, it's a zoo. So we always have to be careful about terming these exhibits. because the idea here is that Europeans have to be on the other side of the fence. And they're there to gaze upon primitiveness. They're there to come into contact, right, with people. You might not be able to see it really well, but a lot of the people at these exhibits were kept in cages. They were kept naked and in cages. And then they would let them put their clothes back on after closing hours. They're also not allowed to leave. Sometimes they can get paid, but most oftentimes it seems like they got paid pittance, if anything. They were often told, just like with the company factory system, they were told that they got paid in food and in shelter, right? These 2x4 houses with a little bit of plaster on them. Here's an interesting image as well. This is in Orléans in 1905. But here you have Africans in the middle, and there's a joke. It's supposed to be a funny postcard. So the joke, it says, at the black village, a little bit of black, a lot of white. Because you see all the people around them. And now look, little kids, right? Little French kids who are brought by their parents to see what little African kids look like. So you're starting very, very young with this idea. Not just children's books, but you're bringing your kids to these locations and you're educating them about the other when they're at these places, right? So there's absolutely no empathy. Now, some people want to sit there and try to act, and you'll see sometimes historians say, well, if you read people's journals or you read the backs of some of these postcards, you know, sometimes they'll note that people looked a little bit embarrassed. Or people looked, maybe the Imperial Project didn't go the way people thought it was. Maybe people kind of sat in this moment, and at the very least, you got to think, if you're saying that some human beings are a missing link, what does that make you? I mean, there has to be some kind of self-critique there. Well, wait a minute, I'm not as special as I used to be anymore. If people who are very close to me, whether you accept difference or not, if you're one of these people, but they, you know, maybe we're not as special as we used to be. Sure, you can kind of say that. But for the most part, what usually happens at these things is they throw mud pies at the Africans. They hurl obscenities at them, they spit on them, they laugh at them, they poke at them. They ask the women to take their clothes off. They ask the men to take their clothes off. It's a joke. It's family fun time during this period. So we have to be very careful about trying desperately to make these people seem maybe like how we would be if we came into contact with something like this, right, as modern people. These are Samoans, again, at another human zoo. That this is actually a car park where you could drive your car through during this period, right? It's like drive-by cultural imperialism. And again, just like you see, now that's the exhibits for average people. But then scientists, what they're going to be doing is taking photographs. They're going to be taking profiles, like we saw in that Romanian image, taking profiles, taking body images of people. They regularly try to bribe, particularly African women, into taking their clothes off and taking nude photographs of them. And again, these are all supposed to be parts of scientific expositions. It's for teaching and learning purposes. So that you can highlight, again, think back to that eugenics tree that we looked at, so that you can use these images in every class and talk about civility, right, versus barbarism, or talk about how Europeans are evolved, and this is your evidence, right, because they don't look like you or they have a darker skin tone than you. This is one of the images that, this is a Khoikhoi woman as well, so she's, you know, part of Saartjie Baartman's legacy. But again, they're going to take all kinds of images of them. So, thinking about a couple of the big events here. You can talk about the exposition in 1889. There's another one in 1900. They have these ethnological expositions and exhibits all throughout these huge world's fairs. And of course, the big story about the 1889 one is what? What's on that poster? The Eiffel Tower, right? I mean, that's civility by building a gigantic metal tower that actually horrified. We look at it now and we're like, oh, that's romance, it's Paris. Parisians were really pissed when that thing went up in the middle of beautiful Paris, right? It took a little bit of time for them to get used to that one. So the ethnological exhibit at the Paris Exposition in 1898 is 400 people. The other notable thing that's happening in 1898 is There's an exposition called, a building called the Exhibit of the American Negro at the same time. It was concocted by members of the Tuskegee Institute, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Booker T. Washington. And it was supposed to tell the story of middle-class African Americans, and they actually highlight the fact that they come from Africa, that they are civilized, that they are wealthy, that they are well-educated, that they're, citizens, and that they should be given rights in the face of things like Jim Crow laws. They won 15 medals, because Europeans are all about their gold medals. They won 15 medals, and the American press didn't cover it. So that tells you sometimes, a story that you're selling, that you're selling to the Parisians at this World's Fair, that they're very interested in, isn't going to sell at home in their imperial project, right? So it's all about place and space within this as well. They get 28 million visitors, and the most popular exhibit is the People Zoo that they had there. It was wicked popular. That was one of the big things that you go to see when you go to this World's Fair. The St. Louis Exposition, this is going to get us into another personalized story of Otto Benga. It was also known as the Louisiana Purchase Exhibition in 1904. This is when Americans throw their hat in the ring of imperialism. Rudyard Kipling writes The White Man's Burden, this really obnoxious poem, and he has it published all over Western Europe as well as the United States, because the whole point of the poem was to encourage Americans to do their duty. To live up to the expectations other white people had of them by participating in imperialism and by taking up their role as paternalists, right? As the people who are going in and accepting that white man's burden of other cultures. And Americans, by the time that you get into the 1890s, they are participating. What areas are they looking at? I know there's some American history students in this class. What are you going to focus on for Americans? 1898.
Hawaii.
I heard the Philippines.
Hawaii, Philippines.
Hawaii.
The Philippines.
Oh, you said something else though.
Cuba.
Cuba, right? And other parts as well. Samoa, for example. I mean, there's a variety of other islands. Puerto Rico is another area that they're going to be focused on. So the American exhibition here is going to look a little bit different. They're going to have people from, yes, South Africa, and from New Guinea, but they're also, in particular, the biggest volume of people at this exhibition is going to be the Philippines and also Native Americans. Native Americans being a representative at this point of the closed frontier. Buffalo Bill's Wild West show sets up camp right outside of the St. Louis exhibition. So there you have somebody who's also has been putting on exhibitions for quite a long time in American East Coast cities. Together with, he actually brings the show over to Western Europe for a while. But 19.5 million visitors there. And this will let us talk about this guy. So Otto Benga is another one of those stories that we can look at to get more of the individual impact of the new imperialism. So Otto Benga, he's from Congo. Anybody who studies imperialism knows imperialism in and of itself sucks. But the one place you don't want to be living in the 1880s or 1890s is Congo. Because the Congo has actually become the private property of the King of Belgium. And he uses it as if it is his private property, which means he's using the African populations there as disposable workforce. And yes, other imperialists do that as well, and we can't take that away. But if you want to see the egregious nature, when you don't have any checks and any balances on imperial, you don't have a parliament to tell you what to do. You actually he closes the borders to Congo. If you're a missionary and you want to come into Congo, you're not allowed to leave Congo. There are no reporters allowed into Congo during this period of time. That's how bad the situation is. And because he sees himself as this old school European absolutist, he can actually control all those borders and do whatever he wants to within it. So he actually creates a secret police force for himself called the Force Publique. And what he did is he went into tribes that were decimated on the interior of Congo. He took all the orphans, he put them up in state schools, and he started up a process where you basically brainwashed all of these young kids into becoming the private security force of the king in Congo. And then he turned around as those kids matured, and he set them on their own population. And it was a decimation policy. The whole idea there was that the basic rule was if Africans are not doing what the king tells them to do and what the government in Congo tells them to do, the force publique sweeps in and they kill everyone. And the deal was to make sure that they kill people, the force publique actually had to turn in hands. So they had to cut off the hand of the person that they killed and they turn it in to get another bullet. So for each hand that you turn in, you get a new bullet from the government. That's how bad it is there. That's the extreme that imperialism can go in all these ideas that we're talking about. The reason Otabenga figures into our story, he's part of the Mabudi people. They were decimated by the force publique during this period of time, and they're going to keep being a target, in particular the force publique. As you get into 1906 and 1907, they're just wiped out during that period of time. He lost his entire family, just like Bartman did. He was a hunter in another hunter-gatherer society. He had gone out, and when he came back, he went elephant hunting. When he came back, his whole village was gone. So he had somebody who approached him at that point, said that he had purchased, purchased from any kind of duty or responsibility, because they're not going to play with the word slavery during this period of time. Europeans are always going to step forward and say, no one's slaves. All the slaves have been freed. But it's basically slavery that you're talking about here. But he had purchased him for a bolt of cloth and a pound of sugar. And then used, as I had said before, he's going to use Otabenga to convince other people that they should come along and be part of the St. Louis expedition. So the whole deal is this guy's in this part of Africa to collect people, and he's particularly focused on the Mabudi people and a couple of other tribes, because these are what's known as pygmies, which a word is kind of debatable. Some people say you shouldn't use it, some people say you should. But that's what they call them during this period of time. Otabenga's 100 pounds. I think he's 4 foot 6 inches tall. He's a human curiosity to Europeans. And so therefore, this guy feels like he's going to get a lot of money by bringing pygmies in, because that's going to be the showstopper for this exhibition. That's what he's betting on. So he brings him to this exhibit in St. Louis. And then from there, what he's going to do is take him with him to New York City. Now, they're not quite sure what to do with him in New York City. And so for a while, they decide that he should just be kind of part of a living exhibit at the Natural History Museum. So they give him like a Southern-styled white linen suit to wear, and he just hung out. He didn't get paid or anything. He would just walk around and greet guests at the Natural History Museum. He finally got himself into trouble because he was really bored, like anybody would be if you're just hanging out in a museum, picking your fingernails and not having anything to do. He got in trouble because, has anybody here ever heard the name Guggenheim before? When you think Guggenheim, what do you think? New York. Art museum, lots of money. So he flung a chair at one of the Guggenheims. There was a sit-down dinner and somebody asked for a chair. And he said, oh, I'll get you a chair. And he acted, because everybody treated him like he was so stupid, that he couldn't possibly understand European or American civility. So he said, sure, I'll get you a chair. And he picked up the chair and he hurled it across the room at her and came about this close to hitting a Guggenheim in the head. And that was the point that he was gently asked to leave the Natural History Museum. And what they did is they set him up at the Bronx Zoological Gardens at that point. And the deal with the Bronx Zoological Gardens, there's a eugenicist who talks regularly with the head of the Bronx Zoological Gardens, and they decided to set up a missing link exhibit. So they had him and a parrot. I'm not sure how the parrot works into this whole missing link agenda. A chimpanzee and an orangutan. They put them into the monkey house, and then they had a sign up that said that you could come and see the missing link, and that he in their minds, this is him, two from the left there, looking a little bit attitudinal. I like Otabenga a lot. He's a very, very curious human being, very interested. He was kind of, the people who talked to him had conversation with him during this period of time. He was interested in getting to know people. He liked to learn English. He liked to kind of hang out with people and get to know this new world he was coming into contact with. But he also thought people were slightly crazy that he came into contact with. I'll show you a good quote by him in just a second. This is one of the images that they take of him. Again, they give him a fake cheetah skin to wrap around himself, or fake cloth to wrap around himself. And then they're going to take images of him for the general population to to talk up the Bronx Zoo with a chimpanzee in his arm. And of course, the highlight there for social Darwinists is that this is the missing link. So any kind of big promotional imagery you're going to see of Ota Benga, he's always going to have that chimpanzee in his arm. This is Ota Benga over here on the right. Now, Ota Benga, what happened is Baptist ministers in the area were, of course, and rightly so, horrified at this whole exhibit. They didn't like the idea of what the story that was being told. They also didn't like the whole idea that you shouldn't treat somebody. Ooh, what just happened? Magic. But they didn't like the idea that you treat Ota Benga or that you treat anybody with this lack of humility. They didn't like that they heard. Yes, I would like to resume the slideshow. There we go. But they didn't like the whole idea that you were treating somebody with this lack of humility. They don't like these social Darwinist ideas. And so they came to the head, and there was enough of a stink in New York City about Ota Benga that they decided that maybe they should just end this exhibit. And then at that point, the Baptist ministers decided that they were going to civilize Ota Benga. So what they did is they put him in a workhouse, and they gave him English lessons, they gave him a new suit of clothes, and then they found him a job in a factory. And the one thing that they were really angry about, and this talks, we got to think about hegemony here. They were really, really angry at the idea that Ota Benga wouldn't forget who he was. That's what they keep talking about. We taught him about how to be civilized. We taught him how to be American. We taught him about religion. We taught him about language. We taught him about culture, right, meaning theirs. And he won't forget who he used to be. He won't forget his language. He won't forget his traditions. So they had pretty much thrown up their hands with him. What happened, Ota Benga desperately, this is the exhibit sign for him. Ota Benga was desperately trying to get back to Congo during this period of time. There was a number of problems in South Africa during this period that didn't let him get home for a while, and then you have the outbreak of World War I, which is going to preclude him from getting home. So what Ota Benga did is he had worked kind of at this factory job at a tobacco farm for a while. Now this is some of the quotes that are really interesting quotes that get you to some of the arguments that we were, kind of elucidating on during this talk. So here's William Temple Hornaday, who's the Bronx Zoological Gardens director. When the history of the zoological park is written, this incident will form its most amusing passage. So to them, this is entertainment. Reverend MacArthur, the person responsible for this exhibition degrades himself as much as he does the African. So there are these other voices at play within this story during this period of time. But again, these are people who still completely accept the idea of civilized versus uncivilized within this. So therefore, it's their job. A humanity for them in treating somebody humanely is teaching somebody how to be a good American, right, and what that looks like. Here's the New York Times. We do not quite understand all the emotion which others are expressing in the matter. It's absurd to make moan over imagined humiliation and degradation Benga is suffering. The pygmies are very low in the human scale, and the suggestion that Benga should be in a school instead of a cage ignores the high probability that school would be a place from which he could draw no advantage whatever. The idea that men are all much alike except that they have had or lacked opportunities for getting an education out of books is now far out of date, right? So it's all about social Darwinism for these people. Here's James Gordon, another Baptist minister. Our race, we think, is depressed enough without exhibiting one of us with the apes. We think we are worthy of being considered human beings with souls. I mean, this has real meaning to African Americans, this kind of exhibit, when you're talking about the pre-World War I period, right? The Jim Crow period. And then here's Ota Benga. Your city is witchcraft and you are all madmen. We gotta let him get in the last word here. That's when he was asked by a reporter what he thought of the city. What ends up happening when he realizes that he's not going to be able to afford a passage, he goes to a shipping office and asks them what it's actually going to cost for him to be able to gain passage to Congo. He realizes he's never going to be able to afford it on a working man's salary. He pulls all they had capped his teeth because the Mabudi actually put they file all their teeth into points. So they had capped his teeth so he would look American. And so he pulled all the caps off his teeth. He tore off all of his clothes. He dressed in kind of one of those animal skins they provided for him before. He did some ceremonies, and then he shot himself in the heart. And they discovered his body the next morning. So that's the real cost, right, of imperialism. Is you've ripped out everything that meant something to these people. You've told them that they're lesser. You've told them they're inhuman. You kidnap them. You torture them. You exhibit them. And then you just leave them at the end of it because they don't live up to your story about the white man's burden and about civilization. Right? This is still at the image that was up there. That's still at the New York. So write your letters to your congressman and a variety of other officials in New York. This is Otabenga. What's down there at the bottom? Pygmy. They refused to put his name. This was taken as a life image of him, a plaster cast of his face, and it's still in their exhibits as Pygmy. So he still doesn't have an identity to this day, right? He's just his race and that social Darwinist construct of his race. So let's think then very quickly, and then I'll take some questions. Let's think about where we see this, why this is so important to this day. Children's books, as I had mentioned before, this is Tintin. You might not have seen Tintin before, but Tintin is the Mickey Mouse of Western Europe. You can go to Tintin stores. This is Tintin goes to the Congo, where he goes to edify and educate people. He talks about the Congolese as a backwards, primitive people. This was written in the 1930s. Over on the left, everybody knows Babar. Babar, the elephant whose parents were killed by imperialists, who decides to go and learn more about those imperialists. So he goes there and he learns their language and he learns their traditions. He likes their culture, and so he dresses in a business suit. He marries an elephant wife. He has 2.5 elephant children, and then they come back to his native land to educate and edify the elephants. Right? We can even see this in Walt Disney. Dumbo. Anybody know what that lead crow's name is in Dumbo? Who all speak jive talk? Jim Crow. It's a joke. Dumbo was made 2 years after Congress refused to pass a law that outlawed lynchings in the South. So this was a joke on African Americans, right? And it feeds into all the images, the jive-talking crows. Come on, the Jungle Book, King Louie. All the other animals speak the king's English, but King Louie speaks this racist cant of the African, or their imagination of the African language. Song of the South, you all probably will never see this. Disney ain't gonna release this one anytime soon on DVD. But Song of the South really plays up with African American stereotypes, particularly the stereotype of Uncle Tom. And Mickey Mouse and Boy Thursday, this is a quote from it. Poor little guy, he just makes mistakes. He doesn't know any better. I'll just have to be patient and teach him the right way to do things. These are children's books and children's cartoons from the 1940s. The last exhibit that we see, 1958, the Brussels World Exposition. This is the last time they have a Congolese village there. By the time that you get into the late 1950s, you're getting into the kind of legacies of post-colonialism. You're not actually going to be able to go and kidnap whoever you want to in this period of time. And you start to see a bigger awareness, right, about maybe these were inappropriate. But don't pat yourself on the back too soon. This is Planet Savage in France. If you see this translated into English, they will call this Animal Planet. Sauvage, what does that mean? Savage, right? So Savage Planet, the animal exhibit at Savage Planet, it's a little safari park in France. The animal exhibits are all of an African village, so you put the animals in the African village. And then they were wondering why it is that people seem to have a problem with Planet Sauvage, right? Kings Island, for any of you who've been there before, when I was little, all the animals, they had the animal safari, and all the smaller animals, just like with Planet Sauvage, were always put in what was supposed to look like African houses. So again, what you're doing there is kind of making this link, right? Between the two. And in 2005 in Augsburg, they decided at the zoo there to host an African village. And we're shocked and appalled when people, particularly the large African community in Germany, had a serious issue with this idea that yet again you have 100 years after this was the fashion, you have them bringing back the idea of Africans within a zoo. Right? I'm going to leave it at that and see if you guys have any questions.
If you have a question, speak into the microphone, okay?
Yes, I was wondering, since you kind of dated all this back to antiquity with Greco-Roman ideas, could we even say that the ideas of differentiation between race, gender, and sexuality can go back even further to the rise of the first cities, like in Mesopotamia and the Middle East?
I see where you're going.
Yeah.
Patriarchy, yes. When you're talking about differences, when starting to categorize women versus men, that comes with first civilizations. The idea that culture should be male-dominated, and then starting to elucidate on the reasons that should be. With race, what you really see that these ideas starting with the Greeks. But then again, you know how few sources, you've taken my classes, you know how few sources we have from the ancient world. Could be that a bunch of people wrote a bunch of crap about all of that. We just don't have it anymore.
I couldn't, because I was just wondering, because if you look in the Old Testament and ancient Israelite culture, they were very big on differentiating themselves from the other. Like if they came in contact with a Gentile, they would have to wash themselves, like they were unclean. They couldn't that be say that the idea of differentiation between race can even go as far back as that?
I think that what you're talking about is a little bit different than race. You're talking about othering.
Okay.
Which, that's you and how you construct identity. This is us versus them, absolutely. You can take it back to ancient civilizations. You can see it even between Sumerian city-states and how they talk about each other. So yeah, that's a really great piece of evidence to bring up is the Old Testament. You really see that there. When we bring in concepts of race, however, and how it starts to get constructed in the Middle Ages, you really see this coming out of the Greek city-states. You see it coming out of, what's happening is Plato and Aristotle, Plato in particular is attempting to underline the importance of Greek domination, and what he means by that is Athenian domination of the general Mediterranean world. So they start setting up all these ideas about who's a barbarian and who's a Greek, and then within the Greeks, how do you differentiate? So, Athens versus Sparta and all those quotes that go back and forth between the two city-states. That's the process. That's when it really kicks up and starting to, not just, when we talk about race, what you start to see, nobody understands it as social construction. They all understand it as it's inherent. So that's where you start to see that idea that there's something different about those people and it's their nature that makes them that way, right?
Thank you.
It's a good question.
I was just wondering, as far as the human Jews are concerned, were the people that were in it, were they stuck in there, or could they leave? And if they couldn't, did they ever try to escape?
I don't have any evidence that says, where are they going to go? You know what I mean? There doesn't seem to be escapes. What you do see, they are not allowed to leave. They actually have to have a pass if they want to leave. And they keep these things open really, really late. So there's not really any downtime. They'll keep it, for Europe, things being open to 8 o'clock and 9 o'clock at night in the 1880s, that's really late. But you actually have to have a pass to be able to leave. You do see there are a couple of moments where they just decide, we're not putting on your show for you anymore. We're done, right? Go sell your own stinking beads. And let's see how well that show goes. There are a couple of moments like that, and they actually agree to pay them at that point. So there are some union issues, let's put it that way, with the workforce there. Sure, it's an interesting issue. But no, I don't see any. Now, Otto Benga, you can actually say what happens is the guy who brought him over, he gets really mad at the Louisiana Purchase exhibit in St. Louis, and he takes him out early. Because he doesn't like how the Africans are being, to him it was too far, that they were being treated, not with the level of low respect that they're normally treated, right? It's even lower than that. They're followed around, they have mud pies thrown at them, they have people spitting on them, things like that, and so what was affectionately referred to as his handler, which is the same thing in zoos, right? It took him out, and that's when he brought him to the Bronx, and then dumped him off at the Natural History Museum.
So what's your take on how where we've come to today with the image of beauty, where that which was once abhorred is now desired? Like you have many white women who want to be brown or
Mhm.
tan, or and they're putting, the injections in their lips to make them fuller, and
Mhm.
they even have butt surgery, which is crazy. And then you have the opposite. You have people like Asians and black people doing things to themselves that
Mhm.
make themselves appear more European.
Mhm.
So what do you think?
What's the take on that? I would say that first and foremost, we have to be a little bit cautious about that, because lumping everything in European ideas versus Eastern ideas or versus Southern ideas, I mean, that can be a dangerous game. Like, for instance, there's been a lot of this relates to socioeconomic issues. I mean, no one gets tans until the 1920s, and Coco Chanel comes back from the Mediterranean, all brown and awesome looking, and that meant that you had the leisure time to sit on your butt in the sun for hours at a time. And so a lot of women actually start getting tans, not having anything to do with other cultures. It's all about money. You look wealthier if you look healthy. And then you have all these people writing about, oh yeah, rich people, I mean, they're tan and they're thin, like Coco Chanel. Asians, there's been a long-standing tradition that paler is better. And it doesn't come out of imperialism. It actually comes a lot longer. It's social class again. People who are a little bit darker are out in the sun. And so therefore you remain as pale as possible to show that you're of a different socioeconomic situation. But I do think that there are, some legacies there that have to be explored. I just don't think that they've been done well. It sounds like you don't either. I haven't seen anything that I'm like, yeah, that really kind of brings imperialism in a way that I understand and I think is critical. I just haven't seen it yet. I think it's there. I just think that no one's been able to really make factual, evidence-based arguments about it yet that I've been happy with.
When they were picking the people for the human zoos, did they typically pick the more unusual looking ones or more the average?
They're going to pick unusual because unusual sells better. And your ability, now think about it from the reverse here, your ability as a business person to be able to solidify what Europeans would see as unusual, you'll get paid more. And people, you'll have more call for your business if you do that. So Kakoi in particular are going to be a target. Mabudi peoples are going to be a target. Anybody who has different, a certain social tradition, for instance, neck rings that stretch out your necks, things like that Europeans can gawk at and can see difference. That's not difference you have to analyze. That's not a difference that you can be critically evaluate. That's difference, and so therefore it's an easier story to sell.
We have time for one more.
Sure.
Do you think that the idea of human trafficking might have come from the human zoos? The fact that you could sell, these exhibitions isn't far from the idea of selling sex.
Yeah, and they did sometimes, as a side, sell sex in these. The deal with human trafficking is, you have human trafficking in the ancient world. It's always been there. It's lately become, part of issues of globalization, where people are actually confronted by it. They can't ignore it anymore. But it's actually been there all along. Particularly, even when you outlaw slavery in Western Europe, you have a thriving slave trade on the eastern borders and on the southern borders of Europe during that period of time. So, I don't think that it's a function, but I do think that it plays in to it as well. There is this general idea, particularly for women, that women are at your disposal, that children and young women in particular are at your disposal, that they're sexual, that they should be made sexually available. And that's one of the stories behind all this, too. The way that European men are writing about women from these other cultures is one where they have expectations. And they really, this plays into their desire. They really do kind of set up this story that African women should be, African and Asian and whoever you're talking about, should be up for their disposal. And that's part of their dividend from the imperial process in general.
How about another hand for Professor Williams? Thank you all for coming.
The Irish History class.